Hi, I'm Alex Griffin, an editor at Haaretz.com in English, and I'm here with Amos Harel, Haaretz's senior military correspondent.
Hi,
Welcome.
Alex.
Welcome, Amos. So before we talk about the informal ceasefire that we know just happened, I wanted to go back a bit and ask you about how this all started. We know we now have 4 Israeli civilians that are dead, which is a very high number, 23 Gazans killed, also a very high number, and 700 rockets fired into Israel. How did this all escalate so quickly?
It actually began escalating about a month and a half ago, just before the Israeli elections. As you may remember, Hamas at that time was applying pressure over Israel in order for Israel to lift some of the siege around Gaza. There were all kinds of negotiations. It was getting pretty close to the elections. Prime Minister Netanyahu was facing political turmoil at home, and the most important thing for him at that time was reaching a ceasefire. Whether it was going to be stable or not, the Egyptians came in, began moving from side to side, talking about this, and eventually, we don't know the full details, but it was agreed that Israel would lift some of the siege, some of the sanctions over Gaza, that Qatar would bring in more money, and that Hamas in return would maintain calm around the border. This more or less materialized, although by the last few weeks, it turned out that the Hamas was not happy with how quickly funds were moving into Gaza. They also were complaining about some of the of what was happening in the border passages. Right. They were expecting more trucks and so on. And Hamas began sending messages to Israel. Islamic Jihad launched a rocket a few days back. By Friday, things got very bad. There was a sniper fire shot at an Israeli commander. 2 Israeli soldiers were wounded. Israel reacted immediately by hitting. It was actually Islamic Jihad that launched that attack, but Israel attacked in return. Hamas members killed 2 of the members of the Hamas military wing. And since then, all hell broke loose. There were 2 days of intensive fighting, which came to a stop more or less this morning at around 7.
So just for people that might not know this, what is the dynamic in Gaza right now between Islamic Jihad and Hamas?
Hamas is in control. Hamas is the regime since 2007. It didn't win any. It won elections a year earlier, but it actually was a brutal military coup in which it threw out Fatah. Since then, it's been in charge. And of course, there have been no elections on either side of the Palestinian front, neither in Gaza or the West Bank, since 2006, 2007. Right. Islamic Jihad is another organization. It's smaller. It's even more radical than Hamas. Sometimes it cooperates with Hamas. We saw this during the last 2 days. Sometimes it has an agenda of its own. It is also under a very significant influence from Tehran. The Iranians are funding Islamic Jihad, and every now and then they give them orders. They tell them what to do.
Right. But in this latest round, Hamas was fully on board.
It began with Islamic Jihad, but quite quickly Hamas joined in, and we have to consider that there's some amount of cooperation going on between those 2 organizations. It was pretty clear that during the last 48 hours they were fully coordinated. Both organizations launched rockets at Israel. They were actually working within a joint command. This is quite important.
So you talk about the Iranian influence on Islamic Jihad. Trump and the U.S. have been really cracking down on the Palestinians, limiting their funds. Israel's been doing that as well. Has that somehow correlated into Iranian action?
I think we're getting into a point where things might boil over in the next few months. We have seen ceasefire agreed apparently by both sides, although Israel is saying nothing officially about this. And right now, things are calm on the Gaza border, but there are too many things happening at the same time. We've talked about Gaza just now. In the West Bank, you see higher tensions. And this has to do with the Palestinians being quite disappointed with the way the Trump administration appears to be presenting its deal of the century. Right. It's a plan for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And on top of everything else, we see more tension between Iran and America. And I think that the Israeli focus is gradually moving to what's happening in Iran and in the Persian Gulf, as well as what's going on in Gaza. And these things are connected, not completely. These are different areas. There are different agendas going on. But yes, Iran influences Islamic Jihad. It has some influence on Hamas as well. There is a possibility that this might escalate rather quickly in the next few months come summer. And we've seen the American announcement just yesterday night. They're sending an aircraft carrier, Abraham Lincoln, to the Mediterranean. That's not the first time that this has happened, but look at the rhetoric. Look at what they're saying. They're saying this is a message this is a message to Iran, and if Iran does anything against us or our allies in the region, it will pay dearly. This is not the kind of language that usually is used under these circumstances. It goes back to the Pompeo plan of a year ago, the 12 points, 12 demands that the Americans have presented to the Iranian regime. I think this is something important going on. We're not seeing the full picture yet, but I think that some of what's happening right now, some of these developments are actually connected to each other.
Right, sure. Is the aircraft carrier into the Mediterranean some kind of a signal that the Trump administration sees Iran is kind of destabilizing the situation?
I think so. Yes,
Israel
we've seen perhaps not exactly over Gaza, but we've heard the same kind of statements from Washington regarding what was going on in Syria just a few months ago. And you remember those incidents between Israel and the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. We've seen periods of escalation before. I don't think that this is over yet. And I think that the Trump administration right now is working on applying more pressure on the Iranians. Some of it is economic pressure. It has to do with the new round of sanctions that was announced about 2 months ago. But this may not be the end of this. And again, if you consider the fact that Trump is presented or seen as relatively weak on Russia, relatively weak on North Korea, here's an opportunity for him to seem tough again when it comes to Iran.
Especially
Netanyahu,
with Bolton.
And Netanyahu is on the same page as Trump over Iran for quite some time.
Right.
I think that we will see more developments there as summer approaches.
Right. So as this round of violence winds down, are there any takeaways? Do you think these 700 rockets, 4 Israelis that were killed, is maybe public confidence in Iron Dome shaken? Did Hamas gain anything?
I think more than anything else, this is frustrating for us as Israelis. In the end, Israel already agreed to give those concessions to Hamas in late March. 6 weeks have passed, 5.5 weeks.
Right.
Israel did not deliver. It had to do with various bureaucratic reasons. Some of this has to do apparently with the Qatari envoy, who has to physically bring the money, but he was in the States because one of his family members received medical treatment there. There are all kinds of bureaucratic reasons. But in the end, we're giving them this Monday morning what we promised about a month ago, and 4 Israeli civilians are dead in the meanwhile. So this is, I don't think that this was necessary. Now, there's a lot of discussion right now. Did we achieve deterrence? Well, we killed many terrorists on the other side, and Hamas buildings were attacked in Gaza and so on. This is not the important stuff. The important stuff is where we're heading with Gaza, and we're heading for disaster. Gaza, everybody knows that. We've been discussing that for the last 2 years or so. The infrastructure there is terrible. According to the UN, by 2020, life conditions, the elementary life conditions would be unbearable in Gaza. This is what's more important, I think, than anything else. All those calculations, all those nuts and bolts about deterrence, or whether the fact that we went back to targeted killing of a certain Hamas operative, did this really deter Hamas? I don't think that's important. I think the bigger picture is more important here. And I still hope that there's a chance to reach not any kind of a long-term peace deal with Hamas, but at least a long-term ceasefire. And this doesn't have to include many Israeli concessions. It's not about symbolic issues. It's about giving more money, allowing more improvement of the infrastructure, whether it's the sewage or the water or the electricity. This is not something that's hard for Netanyahu to pay in order to get some. So
Israel needs to kind of help raise the quality of life in the Gaza Strip.
I'm not putting all the blame on the Israeli side. I think Hamas is playing with fire for quite some time, and I think that what's probably most quite clear for most of our viewers, Hamas has pointed its fire towards Israeli population centers. It was meaning to kill innocent Israeli citizens. This is not something that we can just forget about. But on the other hand, thinking on this realistically, the best alternative for Israel would be to reach some kind of a stable ceasefire, because if we try to occupy the Gaza Strip, we've been there before. We know how this movie ends.
So just as we wrap this up, for now, this is over. For now it's over. In the future, this cycle could continue. Totally unpredictable.
It's quite clear.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm Alex Griffin. This is Amos Harel.
Thank you.
Thank you.